Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading. I don't call them reviews necessarily, they're just me sharing my thoughts. And the two books I'm going to be talking about are Causes One Lost and Forgotten, and Soccer in Sun and Shadow. So I guess I'll start with Soccer. I read this for Nonfiction November, and it also fits nicely into Historathon 2023, the fourth quarter, where we look at history from 1820 to the present, because this is essentially a history of soccer. It's translated, so originally written in Spanish. This one's translated by Mark Freed, and it also has an introduction by Rory Smith, somebody who I sometimes read his soccer columns in the New York Times. And it's a history of soccer, sort of. So I am a soccer fan. I'm not like a rabid sports fan. There are some sports that I kind of enjoy watching on television. Soccer is the one that I enjoy watching the most, actually. And there's some others that I don't mind watching live, but soccer is really the only one that I generally set aside time for and will sit down and watch an entire game. I especially do like international competitions, something like the World Cup, or we got the Euros coming up, and CONCACAF, or the Copa America. So those are the kinds of things that I get most excited about. But I always appreciate a good soccer game, and this had come up on my radar over the last few years. Local bookstore I was happy to see had it, so I thought, yeah, let's give this a shot. You could tell that it is an American edition because it is called Soccer in Sun and Shadow, which I'm pretty sure in the UK it is called Football in Sun and Shadow. And originally published in the 1990s, although this version has some updates up to 2000. What was it? About 2010. So the author, Eduardo Galeano, he died in 2015, and he was Uruguayan, although he did spend some time outside of the country as well for various political reasons. And so this is his take on the history of soccer. However, it is not an objective history, nor is it trying to be. It is not a comprehensive history, nor is it trying to be. It is not an unbiased history, nor is it trying to be. This is a very literary look. It's written in much more literary sense, and it is very much from a Latin American perspective, especially South American perspective, which is interesting. Although sometimes for me that was a little bit of the drawback of it overall. There is some beautiful writing in here, though. I'll just read one part really quick. This is, and by the way, you can get through this book pretty quick. It's mostly told in vignettes, sometimes very short vignettes. Like this whole chapter is just Goal by Maradona. So that's it. Yeah, so you can get through these very quick. But sometimes the writing really grabs me. Like here's one from about the fan. So here he is waxing poetic, as you could say, about fandom. Once a week, the fan flees his house for the stadium. Banners wave and the air resounds with noisemakers, firecrackers, and drums. It rains streamers and confetti. The city disappears, its routine forgotten. All that exists is the temple. In this sacred place, the only religion without atheists puts its divinities on display. Although the fan can contemplate the miracle more comfortably on TV, he prefers to make the pilgrimage to this spot where he can see his angels in the flesh doing battle with the demons of the day. Here the fan shakes his handkerchief, gulps his saliva, swallows his bile, eats his cap, whispers prayers and curses, and suddenly lets loose a full-throated scream, leaping like a flea to hug the stranger at his side, cheering the goal. While the pagan mass lasts, the fan is many. Along with thousands of other devotees, he shares the certainty that we are the best, that all referees are crooked, and that our adversaries cheat. Rarely does the fan say, "My club plays today." He says, "We play today." He knows it is player number 12 who stirs up the winds of fervor that propel the ball when she falls asleep, just as the other 11 players know that playing without their fans is like dancing without music. When the match is over, the fan, who has not moved from the stands, celebrates his victory. What a goal we scored. What a beating we gave them. Or he cries over his defeat, "They swindled us again, thief of a referee." And then the sun goes down, and so does the fan. Shadows fall over the emptying stadium. On the concrete terracing, a few fleeting bonfires burn, while the lights and voices fade. The stadium is left alone, and the fan too returns to his solitude. To the I who had been we. The fan goes off, the crowd breaks up and melts away, and Sunday becomes as melancholy as Ash Wednesday after the death of Carnival. So, pretty cool writing, I would say, to be found in here. And that's definitely the highlight for me, that sort of thing, those moments. The very first half is, it's more about, this is where you see the romance with soccer that he has. But again, it's from a very Latin American point of view. A lot of attention is paid to, for instance, Uruguayan teams. And then the second half, he gets more embittered as we move forward in time with the changes that have happened with soccer. Of course, you have FIFA's corruption, which I absolutely agree with, his frustration there, but also just how the game started to be played more defensively. There was more of a science to the game rather than an art. And he is just kind of hoping for those moments of brilliance where the person seems to fly across the field and, score that perfect goal. It's an interesting read. It's a very fast read. There were some things that I guess kept me a little bit at bay. We do have, like I said, it's not a comprehensive history, but there are actually some errors that I found as I was going through. He talks about at one point the 1942 Dynamo Kiev team. So this is what he has to say about it. For the Nazis too, soccer was a matter of state. A monument in the Ukraine commemorates the players of the 1942 Dynamo Kiev team. During the German occupation, they committed the insane act of defeating Hitler's squad in the local stadium. Having been warned, if you win, you die, they started out resigned to losing, trembling with fear and hunger. But in the end, they could not contain their yearning for dignity. When the match was over, all 11 were shot with their club shirts at the edge of a cliff. Now, I think, of course, that game took place, but all 11 of them being shot on a cliff's edge with their shirts on, I do believe is legend. I think a lot of them ended up in camps, and some of them were eventually shot, but it was not in that kind of cinematic, dramatic way that they were killed. And other little things. On page 53, he starts off this section. He says, Europe had never seen a black man play soccer. And this is like in reference to 1924. And I'm pretty sure the earliest black soccer player is credited as being from Scotland. So that's kind of a weird statement. But it does go along with, like I said, this is a very Latin American view. The way that he describes the history of soccer, it seems like Europe learned soccer entirely from Latin Americans. Any innovation, any great achievement in soccer, it began in Latin America. I'm sure that's partly, some of those things are partly true, but it is very, very biased in that way. And also, I'm an American, but the United States, whenever it's mentioned, it's always mentioned in a negative way. The United States is basically the sum of all of its mistakes, or what he perceives as mistakes. And it gets a little bit too cringy towards the end, making strange kind of historical comparisons. Like the United States shouldn't be concerned with Iran getting a nuclear bomb because we had dropped some on Japan. That those two things don't necessarily have to connect. So, it gets a little bit like, okay, I can see your kind of revolutionary spirit a little bit too much sometimes. There was another, it's not until the end. In the beginning of the book, when he's talking about World War I, I was surprised. I'm like, he hasn't mentioned the Christmas truce and the soccer game that took place out in no man's land. He does mention it towards the end in the extended stuff that he wrote after the original publication, except he puts the Christmas Day truce in 1915 instead of 1914. So again, just another kind of minor error. So, I'm a little bit mixed in some ways. There are times when it really grabbed me, and I was like, yes, okay. It's just like he was looking for those beautiful moments in a soccer game. I was also looking for, and sometimes finding beautiful moments within this book as well. But sometimes the very kind of biased perspective that we get in here just grated on me some. And we have little vignettes about various, again, I'm a soccer fan, but I was not like raised in soccer culture. I'm an American, and my family, my father, he was an American football fan. So I had friends growing up that a lot of them were immigrants and were soccer fans, and we used to go around the neighborhood with a soccer ball all the time and do trick shots and things like that. But I was not immersed in soccer history or soccer culture. So on the one hand, it was nice to get a little bit of a primer on some of that. There were some things that I knew, but a lot of it was new to me. But it also means that, if we have a little vignette about a nice goal from a person that I've never heard of, and I don't really always know the context in which this is being made, it's not going to stick with me. But anyhow, I overall enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it. Those are just, again, my thoughts on this whole thing. And the other thing that I finished, which was nice, it was actually a pretty quick read because good chunks of this book are actually images. So there are long sections where we just get tons of images. So it's actually, it ended up being a much quicker read than it would otherwise look to be. But this is by Gary W. Gallagher, who I believe he won, did he win the Pulitzer? I'm trying to remember, for history. I'd have to look. I did read another thing by him, which I think was it Lincoln at Gettysburg that I read by him? I should have looked that up again before I started filming, but anyhow, I know I've read something else by him. Anyhow, this is Causes 1, Lost and Forgotten, How Hollywood and Popular Art Shaped What We Know About the Civil War. So I am a film fan, kind of a film buff, and I do love historical films or films about history. And I also love kind of tearing them apart sometimes, not just with historical accuracy, but I'm immensely curious about the ways that we choose to remember the past, and sometimes how that's used in the present for, more immediate ends in our own time. And I think this is especially true of the Civil War. A conflict which the United States is still sort of parsing out in a lot of ways. And that's for various reasons. For the first 100 years after the war was done, even though the North won, the South really controlled the narrative. They controlled how it was discussed, especially in the South, but it certainly bled up into the North as well. So it wasn't until about 100 years later that you would even really start hearing anything about slavery being a part of the war. So a lot of historians, what their work has been over the past 50 years or so, is to try and course correct and trying to get at the real history. There's a lot to go through. And Hollywood doesn't always do a great job of reflecting scholarship. That's not really their purpose, right? They want to entertain, they want to make money. They're not necessarily there to inform. And some movies certainly do a better job than others. He, of course, does talk about The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith as part of the Lost Cause narrative, and Gone with the Wind as well. However, his real focus is on the 20 years up until this publication. So this was published in 2008. So really he's looking at like 1988 to 2008. And he's looking at the 4 themes or threads or narrative themes, I guess that you could say, narrative pathways that you can take to remember the Civil War and how they are shown basically in movies. That doesn't really make sense the way I'm saying it, but essentially what we're saying is one way that they can look at the Civil War is through the Lost Cause lens. That, this is what the South basically was trying to say the war was about after the fact. That it really wasn't about slavery, and that even, slaves really weren't that unhappy, and it was, the South was a place filled with honor, and they were just overwhelmed by the numbers that the North had. It's a perspective that has been thoroughly debunked by evidence. But that's one way that you can look at the Civil War, and that's what was the way up until around the 1950s. So other ways that you can look at it is through the a reconciliation lens, which focuses on the bravery and honor of both sides of the conflict. And it's really about how these two white societies will be able to come together at the end. And in that case, slavery is hardly ever discussed at all. You can also do the emancipation narrative, which is really focusing on the Civil War as really being about abolishing slavery. A movie like Glory is going to fit into that. And the fourth one is, one of the more interesting things about this is, the fourth one is largely ignored by Hollywood altogether, even though it was incredibly important during the Civil War. And that's the Union narrative. That, thousands, hundreds of thousands of these Northerners signed up for the Army in order to preserve the Union. It was really out of a patriotic sense that they wanted to preserve what was created by the Constitution and by the Founding Fathers. And that is something that, for various reasons, Hollywood does not focus on. Even though if you read their letters, if you read what the soldiers said, that's really their primary reason. Emancipation would come very much second in that. But so much of these movies are really made after a Vietnam era, where a conflict that became very unpopular, that divided the nation, that gave us things like the My Lai massacre. And in this case, especially Northern soldiers in Hollywood are often depicted as not caring at all about the Union cause. And it's like a rich man's war and they're the poor, and they are often shown in pretty terrible light, and more like we would expect a Vietnam War movie to be like. Indiscriminate killing, massacres, just not really caring about the people that are in front of them, which isn't really true for the Northern soldier. I mean, yeah, there were certainly some bad things that happened on both sides, but Northern soldiers, for the most part, they were pretty well behaved, except for there are definitely some exceptions, but for the most part, they were fairly well behaved. And they really did have a strong sense of duty to preserve the Union. And that's just not something that Hollywood seems to believe in when it shows. So he goes through how these various things have shown in movies, which ones have focused on it. Of course, the Lost Cause has largely gone away, except he's very right to say that Gods and Generals, Ron Maxwell's second Civil War movie, Gettysburg, his first one, is really more of a reconciliationist narrative, but Gods and Generals is very much a Lost Cause narrative. And up until 2008, he said that's pretty much all that we've seen of the Lost Cause, but we have seen others since then. I think there's The Field of Lost Shoes or something like that. There was one that came out some years ago, so we still end up seeing it. And this is also before the controversies of the Confederate statues being torn down. So it would have been really interesting to see, if he had written this a little bit later when that stuff was happening, what it would have come down to. So it's not just movies that he's looking at. He is also looking at the popularity of art, Civil War art. So there are lots of fine art pieces that people buy in very large numbers. So what he did was especially look at Civil War magazines and look at their catalogs, and what things were being offered, and going to different various places you can go to for statistics to see what sold more. And he's finding that, Confederate themes, General Lee and Stonewall Jackson especially, they are painted far more than the North. They sell far more than the North. And a lot of them really reflect Lost Cause themes pretty heavily. Some of them are just absolutely ridiculous. Some of them I've seen. See if I can find it's like the Christian general. Here's Robert E. Lee reading the Bible. The child, sleeping on his shoulder. It's like, give me a break, man. It gets pretty ridiculous. But he's finding that, the Lost Cause is very much alive in that kind of fine print artwork that people buy. That the North is not depicted nearly as much, and often not, when it is depicted, often not by as capable artists. So the people who seem to be buying a lot of this artwork are people who, by and large, seem to be, invested in the Lost Cause narrative. So not exclusively, but this seems to be what the evidence suggests. So Anyhow, interesting stuff for me. Absolutely. This is a longer video than I expected it to be, kind of rambly. But these are two that I found quite interesting. So we got Soccer and Sun and Shadow by Eduardo Galeano. And we got Causes One Lost and Forgotten, How Hollywood and Popular Art Shape What We Know About the Civil War by Gary W. Gallagher. If you've read either of these, excuse me, loved your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.